interact with Postgres database, we already saw that there are actually two ways, right? Using entity manager, you can interact with Postgres database, and using Postgres to do using a JPA also you can interact with Postgres database. So there is one more session factory. Using session factory also you can interact with Postgres database. So in my application, what I have done is, based on configuration, okay, I will be using either entity manager or session factory or JPA. This is actually the JPA way of interacting with the Postgres database. So first let's look into what is the difference between these three while interacting with the Postgres database. So all these three implementations, right, this Postgres, like, which uses the JRepo and entity manager, all these three things which we discussed, they actually use Hibernate as a JPA provider. Okay, so JPA is a specification, right, how to assess data between Java objects and relational database. Okay, so Hibernate is the implementation of JPA. So when you use JRepo, it actually uses the Spring Data JPA, which is built-in support for Hibernate. So what when you use this, right, our life becomes easy, right? To interact with the database, there are standard APIs which we can use to interact with the database. So when we use Postgres, how our interaction will look like is, this is how it looks like. So in your DAL layer, just have this JRepo object. You can auto wire it. Spring Boot will auto wire this JRepo, and to get all the to do, this object to do repository I'm having, right, dot find all, it will give all the to dos, right? And so this actually implements your to do repo JPA, right? So you get all to dos, create to do. To create a to-do comes to this layer. You just set the ID using this UID, random UID, and then just to-do repo.save. To get all the to-do, find all. To save an entry, just to-do the repository.save, and you just give the to-do object. Okay, so ideally, if you see, right, this is the main advantage of using JPA. If you want to save an entry in the database, ideally what you have to do is, right, basically you need to write a query like insert into the table, right? Instead you're calling this to do repository.save. So this basically, right, it will invoke Hibernate functions. So and Hibernate will convert, will use this object. From the object, Hibernate will actually create the SQL query, right? We will see the Hibernate architecture shortly, but Hibernate will create the SQL query of insert into, and then it will insert the data in the database. So for us, the life is easy. We just saving the Java object. So we are just giving an object to Hibernate, and Hibernate takes the data from the objects. It creates a query insert into, and it inserts to the database. So you need to update, right? This all we saw in the previous video itself. To update, first I am finding the record. Okay, and once I find, right, it gives an optional. If the record is present, because the ID can be wrong, right? I'm updating a record, the ID can come wrong. If it is present, then I'm getting that record, and then I'm updating it, the record, and then I'm saving it in the database. Okay, so instead of doing all this, if the record is ID is not present, I'm just returning an empty optional. So that this is called from the service layer, right? So in the service layer, if the option is empty, I will return an error, I will raise an exception. But instead of doing this, the other way of doing it is this find by ID return an optional, right? So dot map I can put, I will get the, if the ID is present, I will get this. Okay, dot map, I will get this. I am updating it here. Okay, in this map function, I am actually updating it, and then I am returning it. Okay, suppose this find by ID, if the ID is not found, right? If the ID is not found, I am just returning an empty optional. If you see, I am returning this complete thing here, correct? This is what I am returning here. So if the ID is not there, this will return an empty optional. If the ID is there, this map function is going to return me that record, save and return me the record. That record will be, I'll be putting in an option and returning it. So it's the other way of doing it. And delete also, you just call to repository or delete by ID. So when you use JPA, this is how you do the CRUD operations. And this JPA will internally use Hibernate. So here we are using the Spring Data JPA repository that will actually internally uses the Hibernate to manage entities, to execute the queries and all. That internally uses Hibernate. It's just a layer above Hibernate to make our life simple, right? To interact with the database. The other way of doing it is the entity manager. So instead of this JRepo, right, we need to have an entity manager here, and then using the entity manager, you can interact with the database. Here, this entity manager class is implemented by Hibernate. Okay, so here you can use some custom queries. Okay, and you can have manual transaction control. So if you want little control over interacting with the database, then you go for entity manager. So when you use entity manager, let's see how to do the CRUD operations. So when you use entity manager, you need to have an entity manager object. You use persistent context annotation here, the object will be auto-wired here. And get all, you just need to create a query. Select star from, here you have to mention the class. From which model, right? You mention this to-do model JPA class, right? Which is there here. So that is annotated with entity and what table it is. Okay. So when you just create a query from this class, the complete result set, it will get you all the data of all the entries in the to do, right? And to create an entry, you just need to call that entity manager.persist to save an entry. You can also use save, but in the latest version you have to use persist. And then for update, you have to use update and you have to use merge, entity manager.merge, and give the existing to do. It will merge it. And to delete, just call remove, entity manager remove. This is how you do CRUD operation with entity manager. Okay, and here to find the to do, you have to use entity manager.find, right, to get the to do. Right, here also you have to use entity manager.find. Here you have to mention the model class. Okay, so I will give this Git repo URL in the description, and you can also find it in the description of this code. You can have one question, right? You call to-do repository.find all. How it will choose from which table it will get all the records. So this JRepo, right? This JRepo is nothing but an interface. It extends the JPA repository. Here you have to mention the model class. And you have to mention the data type of the primary key. Now the ID is string actually. So I have mentioned as string. So here from this model, right, from this entity only, it will get all the records. So in case if you have more than one table, you need to have more than one JRepo to get records or do update the table. Okay, this is how this is actually the JPA, how to interact with using JRepo, right? Interface JPA repository. Using JPA, this is actually JPA repository. Using JPA repository, how to interact with the database. Using entity manager, how to interact with the database. Next, we'll go into the session factory. So this is actually the core of Hibernate. When you use session factory, right, we need to have a session factory which is nothing but a factory of sessions. For every interaction, you have to open a session. So suppose I want to get all to-dos. From the session factory, I have to open a session first. Then I have to create a query from to-do, and here I have to mention my entity class, and that I am converting it to a list and returning. So for every interaction with the database, I have to open a session. So in turn, this session factory is the core of Hibernate. Both entity manager and JPA repository we are using, finally the Hibernate will use the session factory and sessions to interact with the database. Right? So if you want to create apart from get, right, if you want to create, update or delete, you have to start a transaction, then only you can enter the database. So from the session factory, you just create a session, you just open a session, and then you begin a transaction, right? So because every create, update and delete, it has to be done inside the transaction so that it is easy to roll back the transaction. right? Any issues happening in the transaction, we can easily roll back. So you begin a transaction and then you save it. So persist is the function used to save, you're giving the entry, it is saved, and then you commit the transaction. Okay, so this is how you do a create to do. And for update also the same thing, right? You have to open a session, begin a transaction, check whether the ID is already there or not. If the ID is already there, only you can update, right? Then set the title, set the description. Now you have to merge and then commit the transaction. And with that, create an optional and then return. If the ID is not there, then return an empty optional, so that in the service layer we can return an exception. So delete also same thing, just we need to start a transaction, and inside the transaction first get that ID, and if the ID is not if there is a to do, then we can delete it and then commit the transaction. So this is how you do CRUD with session factory. So here you have a session factory, right? This session factory object, it is auto wired here, right? Now this session factory object we have to create. Okay, Spring Boot will not create it for us. So what I am doing is, so in the application properties, if the storage is session, then only I will create the session factory. So by default in the config, right, in the Hibernate config, what I do is I create a session factory. So to create a session factory, right, we need to know the database details. What is the URL of our Postgres database? What is the username, password? All this information will be, we have to put it in the Hibernate config.xml file. So Hibernate config.xml file is here. So all the database details, right, connection, URL, right, and username, password, the dialect we are going to use. We are going to use the Postgres dialect, and then Hibernate update, auto is update, okay, and show if you put true, whatever, when you interact with the database, all the SQL queries will be shown. So first you have to have this configuration file, and using the configuration file, you have to first you have to create a configuration object, then configure configuration file, okay, and once you create this object, dot build session factory. So now a session factory is built. Now you have put admin, so this session factory will be there in the IOC container. Since you put admin, whatever object you are returning, right, you are returning a session factory object. So this will be in the IOC container, and that is what I will be auto wiring in my session factory here. Okay, so this is the case. Now here, so simple. So Hibernate, by underlying, it uses a session factory. But now I face the issue. The issue is this JPA repository which you are using, right? What happens is it internally uses an entity manager. So the Spring Boot will create an entity manager factory. So using entity manager only, this JPA repository will interact with the database. Now, since I'm using session factory also, right, the Spring Boot didn't create the entity manager factory for me. So I faced some issue. The entity manager factory is not available. So I had to create this entity manager factory object myself. So for that, in the config, I add this. So what I have is, at configuration I have put, and this function, right, I am creating the entity manager, so that this entity manager can be used by the JPA repository and here. So for that, what I have to do is that local container entity manager factory, first I have to create an object, okay, and I have to update the data source for this entity manager, and the packages for the entity manager, you have to tell what are the packages to scan. So I am mentioning the packages here in the model, right? This model folder I have given. So these packages will be scanned by the entity manager. And vendor adapter also, I'm creating a vendor adapter. I'm setting the vendor adapter for this entity manager, and properties I have to select, right? The dialect update. I'm setting the JPA properties also. I'm returning the entity manager. This is a admin. So this entity manager I have created and I pasted in the IOC container. So this entity manager will be used by my JPA repository. So I had this issue, so I had to create this entity manager. I had this issue because since I'm using session factory, the Spring Boot didn't create. So before it was working fine. Since I also had session factory, the entity manager was not created and I had to create it manually. Okay, now let's get into the architecture of Hibernate. Okay, so before entering into the architecture of Hibernate, right, let's understand what problem Hibernate solves. See, if without Hibernate, right, we would have used JDBC. JDBC is Java Database Connectivity. Suppose to get to do, right, what you have to do if you use JDBC is, first I have to frame the query, right, using SQL query only you can, so first I have to frame the query, and then I have to get the connection. I have to give the URL, password, first get the connection, okay, and then I have to prepare a statement, right, with this SQL query I have to prepare a statement, and then I have to execute the query. When I get the result, right, I will be getting a lot of to-dos. I have to loop through all the to-dos, right, and I have to loop through all to-dos. For every to-do I have to create an object, okay, and the object I have to put it in a list, and this list is what I have to return. So converting, when I enter the database, the data, I have to write the code to create the object and return the list of objects, right? This is the boilerplate code. This can be avoided when we use Hibernate. So when you use Hibernate, right, in case when you use entity manager, I need not loop over create the object and all. I just calling the create query function. It gives me the list of objects. So the Hibernate is a ORM tool, right? Object relation mapping tool. So it creates the object and give me the list of objects. I need not write the code to create objects and all. Right? That is the advantage, main advantage of using Hibernate. Right? It makes the life simple. So what is the architecture of Hibernate is? So in the Hibernate there are these layers are there. So we application layer, right, uses the Hibernate API. So from our application we will call the Hibernate APIs, right, like find all the Hibernate APIs we are calling for database interactivity. So then the Hibernate API layer comes, right. So and it has the basically the core of Hibernate is session factory. Session factory has list of sessions. You need to have sessions to for every interaction with the database you need to have one session, right. So next layer is the API layer which has the session factory, session and transaction, all this are provided by the Hibernate API layer. Then the configuration layer, like the database, right, the URL, the username, password, all these are in the configuration layer. Now comes the session factory. This session factory there will be only one object. It is a singleton object for one database. So one session factory will be used for one database, right, and for every single transaction, either it be create, read, update, for every transaction we need to open a session. To ensure data integrity, right, we use transaction to commit and roll back. And there is something called as Hibernate query language, which we already have used, right. Here we have used, right. So here you see when you use session manager, here you are creating a query. This is the Hibernate query language. So this Hibernate query language will work with all the database, irrespective it is Postgres or MySQL. This Hibernate query language will work with all the database. So that is the advantage of using Hibernate query language. It gives us the flexibility of writing queries, and we need not worry about whether the query will work or not. So next comes the JDBC layer that converts that API session into actual SQL queries. So Hibernate internally uses the JDBC to interact with the database, right. You need to have it does the SQL, it uses JDBC to create SQL queries and fire the SQL queries, and finally the database which actually stores and retrieves the data. So this is the architecture of Hibernate. So now let's now run this code and see. So here in the DAL layer I have put some prints, okay. Right now let's go to the application session properties. Okay, now it is session. Since application session property is session, okay, and okay, if it is entity, you return entity manager. If it is JPA, otherwise you return the session factory object. Okay, so this configuration we have already saw in the previous videos. So let's not deep dive into it. So based on that, now since the value is session, this object will be returned. This object is what stored in the service layer, right. Here you have auto wired whatever. So this is what is stored in the service layer. Okay, so our session factory functions will be called, right. So let's try to run it. So get all to do. This print has to come, and we have to see all the to dos. I use Postman. Okay, I fire a get all to do. Okay. Okay. See, now I'm seeing all the to dos, right? There are 3 to dos. I'm using Avan online database. So I'm using PG admin. So select star from database. So there are 3 records in my database. I'm using PG admin here, and all the 3 records I'm able to see here. Okay. So in my application, get all to do session factory. So this print has come, which means that this is now going through the session factory. Okay. And create to do, let's also do a create to do, add a to do, dance 10 is here. Let's put dance in gym. Okay. Let's add this to do. Okay, so session create to do. Now the to do is added. Now if I go and fire the query again, there should be 4 entries. So dance and gym. So database is also updated. And similarly, I can update also. Right? To update, let's go into the thing. For update, let me update this itself. I need to have the ID to update. So go to update, put the ID here. I put the ID. I am updating as tennis dance. Okay. Tennis dance, not gym. So this basically this ID, right? 2932. Where is the 2932? 2932. Go to dance at 1 p.m. Dance in gym. That should be tennis dance. That should be updated as tennis dance, not gym. Okay, I'm sending it. Let's see what is the thing. Okay, looks like it is updated. What reply I got? I also got a reply. Let me check the PG admin. This should be updated, right? Dance and gym should be updated. Tennis dance, not gym. This is updated. So I'm able to update. Let me delete this record also. So let me go to delete. Okay, here let me update this with the ID. Send. Deleted successfully. So using session factory, I did all the CRUD operations. So the entry is deleted. If I execute the query alone, that final entry has to go. Yes, it has gone. So now I'm using session factory, right? Now if I want to use JPA, what I have to do? If I want to use entity manager to enter the database. So if I go to the config here, Postgres config, if I put entity, it will use entity manager. If I put JPA, it will use Postgres, right? So I will just go here to the application properties. Instead of session, I will put JPA. And I have to stop and start my application. Okay, now application is started. Now, right, now if I get to do, right, get all to do, this function should not be called. Get all to do session factory should not be called. Actually, this function has to be called. Get JPA get all should be called. Okay, so let's fire the get all. Okay, JPA get all is getting called, and I'm also able to see all the to dos. Okay, so based on configuration, I am using either session factory, JPA repository. This is actually JPA repository or the entity manager. Okay, and I'm able to get the data. All internally uses Hibernate only, and the core of Hibernate is the session factory, session and transaction. On top of this only, you have entity manager and the JPA repository.